Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Ave Maria Press Professional Development Webinar Series. In this webinar, sociologist and bereavement doula, Dr. Abby Jorgensen, will provide insights from both research and practice on how we can respond when we are informed of a loss, especially in a ministerial capacity. My name is Erin Pierce. I'm the interim publicist at Ave Maria Press. Everyone in the audience is muted today, but you are able to ask questions. Questions can be sent to our guest using the questions section of the GoToWebinar panel, which you see here on the screen, and I'll read as many of those as possible at the end of the presentation today. This webinar is being recorded, and I will send you a link to the recording tomorrow via email, which you are welcome to share with everyone. With that, I would like to welcome and introduce our presenter today. Abigail Jorgensen is an assistant professor of sociology and healthcare ethics at St. Louis University, as well as a certified doula and childbirth educator. She conducts grief-informed research-based trainings for those supporting families with perinatal loss. Jorgensen earned a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and a PhD from the University of Notre Dame. She is a member of DONA International, Lamaze International, and the American Sociological Association. Jorgensen also facilitates a bereaved parents community group. She has spoken at conferences for the American Sociological Association, the De Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture, DONA International, and Femme Catholic. She's appeared on Cresta in the Afternoon and been featured in Today's Catholic and the National Catholic Register. She has written for Femme Catholic, The Young Catholic Women, and Notre Dame Magazine. She's received awards for her writing and teaching, including being named a Richard and Peggy Notebart Premier Fellow at the University of Notre Dame. Abby, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Erin. I'm so glad I get to be here, and I'm so grateful to you and to everyone who's willing to spend some of their time thinking about some really tough stuff today. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and make you presenter.
All right, wonderful.
Okay, you can take it from here.
Wonderful, thank you. So thank you again, everyone, for being here. Talking about loss and how we interact with people who have experienced a loss takes a lot of bravery. So before we jump into our content for today, I want to thank you for taking the time and the emotional energy to think about how we respond when someone experiences a loss. And specifically a miscarriage, a stillbirth, or an infant loss. Those are my areas of expertise, but I do get to study grief in many forms. Older child loss, the loss of a parent, the loss of a sibling. And there's so much richness in practice that we can take and use, but there's also so much richness in the research that we've done on these topics that can show us what it's like to respond to someone in a way that supports them compared to in a way that distances them from ourselves or from the church, depending on our capacity. So when we talk about miscarriage, stillbirth, and infant loss, these are terms that refer to the loss of a child sometime between their conception and their first birthday. And just to give you a sense of how common this is, I want to share with you the statistics of how frequently we tend to see these kinds of losses occur. So according to our best guess, miscarriages, at term pregnancy, so when a baby is fully developed in utero, around 1 in 1,000 of those pregnancies will end in loss. 1 in 1,000 of those babies will pass away. So think about if you serve 1,000 families, there is a good chance that one of those families has experienced this kind of full-term loss. Even earlier in pregnancy, we see a much higher rate of loss. Around 1 in 160 pregnancies after 20 weeks end in loss. So 20 weeks is that halfway point for a pregnancy. It's often the time that people are getting ultrasounds that tell them the baby's sex. They're getting excited about registries and baby showers. And even after this point, we still see 1 in 100 pregnancies end in loss. So if you think about a family in your parish who maybe has 4 children, you only need 40 of those families before statistically it's pretty likely that one of those families has experienced a loss after 20 weeks of pregnancy. And finally, when we come to the most common form of perinatal loss, miscarriage, we see that 1 in 4 clinically recognized pregnancies end in a loss. So clinically recognized means that I, as the pregnant person, was able to go to my medical care provider and they were able to write in my chart that I was pregnant. So I had to stay pregnant long enough to even get a doctor or a midwife to note that in my chart. And by that time, maybe 8 weeks gestation, 1 in 4 of those pregnancies will still end in loss. So if you are working in a parish setting or if you are working with families, there is no statistical way that someone in your care or someone that you interact with on a regular basis has not been touched by perinatal loss of some kind. So this can be intimidating for many of us. The fact that there's so many miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant losses, let alone other kinds of losses, mean that this is something that people interact with on a daily basis. The people that we see, the people that we care and minister to, all of those people have a very high chance of having experienced one of these different kinds of loss. And yet, I don't think our society prepares us very well for how to minister to those people in the moment when we find out about a loss. And that can be really intimidating to think about, what do I say when someone tells me about this? What do I do when someone discloses that they have experienced or are experiencing one of these kinds of loss? So one of the things that I think underscores how unsettling that kind of situation can be for us is the reality that thoughts and emotions really come out here. So what thoughts and emotions come out for our minds when we think about that moment of learning that someone is experiencing a perinatal loss? When we think about answering the parish phone and someone saying, "Hi, I didn't really know who to call, but I'm having a miscarriage." Or the moment where somebody who had posted on the church Facebook group asking for prayers for their upcoming ultrasound posts again to let everyone know that they got the worst news imaginable. Thoughts and emotions that can come up for us in these moments might include things like uncertainty. What do I do? What do I say? There may even be some fear, some sense that I don't want to hurt someone's feelings. I don't want to make a situation worse. And it seems like there's so many ways that we can do things wrong in that moment, right? Say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing. Sometimes it feels easier to just do nothing at all. But I really hope that I can convince you today that doing nothing at all is one of the worst ways that we can support families. Doing something is better than doing nothing. So we might experience fear, we might experience uncertainty. We might even experience hesitation or confusion about what's going on. Sometimes people don't realize that a family may know about a baby's death before that baby has even been born. So it might be really confusing to us that someone is currently pregnant, but they say that their baby has died, right? There can be these kinds of biological realities that we may not be familiar with. But the thoughts and emotions are often shared. Even if we understand the biology, even if we know what's happening, we can still worry about how to respond, or we can still be uncertain about the best way to sit with someone in their grief. So today, I'm hoping that I can provide you with some insight on how I approach people in these scenarios, how I respond in these scenarios, and how I work to respond, reflecting on my many years of work as a bereavement doula, which is a medical paraprofessional who works with families who experience miscarriage, stillbirth, or infant loss. So I get to support them physically, emotionally, spiritually, informationally, advocationally, and more. And in that capacity, I've learned a lot about what it means to mess up, what it means to act on my fear instead of acting on my care or love or support for the person. And as a researcher, I've gotten to study what happens when we mess up, what happens when we don't try to support families. And the outcomes are really, really negative. And specifically, it's interesting to see what kinds of outcomes this can have for our ministry in particular. Just today, I posted a reel on Instagram and somebody commented on that reel publicly that they had a pastor tell them when they told them that they were experiencing a loss, the pastor told them, well, maybe you didn't pray to God enough. And that person commented that they have not prayed to God since. So the kinds of things that we say really matter in these scenarios, right? So let's dig into more knowing these thoughts, knowing the uncertainties that can come up, knowing the emotions, maybe the fear, the hesitation of doing something wrong. Let's dig into, what does that actually look like? Big moments bring up big questions. And I think that's why it's so scary or so uncertain how we're supposed to respond in a given scenario. If you have someone who is saying that life and death are on the line for them here, or they're wondering how God can be all good and all powerful and their baby can still die, these are really, really big questions. And yet at the same time, the person who's in front of us may need immediate care that isn't philosophical at all. They may need a ride to the emergency room or labor and delivery unit. They may need a meal. They may need someone who's just willing to sit and listen to the story of their child. These big questions come with very practical needs. And sometimes it can be hard for us to figure out what a person will be best served by in a moment. Will they be best served by answering or talking about or thinking about those big questions? Or will they be best served by that practical love and care? And I'm going to posit to you today that the answer is both. But the best way that we can serve through the big questions, through the immediate needs, is to listen to what that person needs in that moment. So let's start off with talking about the ways that this looks for Catholics. If we think about big questions that can come up, I had alluded to before, if you're looking at life and death, those are really big questions. But for people who are Catholic, there can be some additional questions that come up, right? And this is a lot of the questions that I cover in A Catholic Guide to Miscarriage, Stillbirth, and Infant Loss. Look at these kinds of questions. How can God be good and powerful and still let my baby die? Is this punishment for something, right? These kinds of really big, but also practical questions that leave me with not really a good sense of who I am or who God is or who my church is. And in that moment, in those big questions, you and I, we are the church. So how do we as a church respond to these kinds of questions, particularly from Catholics who may be experiencing loss or be a part of a family or friend group that is experiencing loss? So we're going to start off with some best practices for how you don't do things. So when we look in research, we see over and over that these activities, which spell out the acronym PAD, are unhelpful for families, are unhelpful for the people who are receiving that kind of care. So PAD, 3 strategies that I'm going to suggest you not do if at all possible. So the first is do not preach. P is for preach. So a lot of times when someone says something that sounds like a question or has a big question in it, our impulse may be to answer. And I'm a really curious person, maybe you are too. I like learning about things, I like knowing interesting facts. And so when someone says, oh, I don't know about this, or oh, I'm really wondering about this question, and I know the answer, the first thing I want to do is say the answer, right? And one thing that's really hard, but very necessary for me to do as a grief worker is to realize that when people ask a question, especially if it's something about God, they may not actually be looking for me to answer them. So if someone says, how could God allow this? Maybe they don't actually want me to go into a theological discussion, right? Maybe they don't actually want me to tell them what God might think of their sin or what God might think of their body or why sin and death exist in the first place. Maybe they just want me to sit with them in the question. So the idea that someone asks these big questions or wonders about these big topics doesn't mean that we need to provide an answer. There's a really common saying in the grief scholarship, especially Dr. Alan Wolfelt, who's a great resource if you're looking for information about how to be a grief worker, especially if that wasn't what you meant to be, but you became an accidental grief worker. And he often says the bereaved have the right to make their own meaning. So if we are preaching, if we are telling someone, this is what you should take away, right? That can actually be much more harmful than beneficial because the bereaved have the right to make their own meaning. So let's take an example here. Sometimes when people say that they've had a loss, the ministers in their life or the representatives of the church in their life might say something like, God must have really wanted your child. Now, this might be really comforting for some people, that preaching, that proclamation that God loves your child, right? Fundamentally, that could be really beautiful. But also for other people, this is not helpful. In fact, it can be really harmful. God really wanted my child? What, and God didn't want my living child? Like God left my living child here? God left me here? God just wanted to take whatever God wanted and let me deal with the suffering and the consequences and the fallout of that, right? That can be so hurtful to internalize as a lost parent. So when we preach, when we share the answer, right? God must have wanted your child. That can come from a really beautiful place of wanting to assure somebody of God's love for their child. But actually, the reality is that families will make meaning from that may not be what we wanted them to take away, right? It may be far more hurtful. So I encourage you to think about the bereaved as having the right to make their own meaning. We can sit with people in the questions, we can help them look up the answers, but when we preach, there's a good chance that we're going to do more harm than good in responding to these big questions. The next best practice that I want to suggest you do is avoid assuming. Right? So PAD, pad, we're at preach and now we're at assume. Do not assume if you at all can. So one way that this comes up for a lot of families is in the ritual of funerals. So for many cases of stillbirth or infant loss, families may have access to a body that they may be able to bury. And so the church may be able to provide something like a funeral for them, or a burial mass, depending on the situation. Some dioceses don't allow full funeral masses for babies who are not baptized when they die. So that's a whole question that we don't have time to get into today. But if you're curious, please reach out to me and I would love to chat with you more about that. The idea of assuming can come across when somebody at the church says, "How can I help you plan for the funeral?" This is a really kind question. This is a really loving question that comes from a good place, right? But the assumption here is that the family can have a funeral. In order to have a funeral in the Catholic Church, you do have to have the body, right? You have to have the remains. And many families do not have access to the remains of their child. Sometimes their little one is just too small and there's no way to find them, right? There's no way to identify where that baby's body is. And sometimes priests will allow a funeral to happen anyway with whatever remains are there, not knowing if the baby's body is there or not, and sometimes priests will not. So knowing that some families won't have access to a body because they won't be able to find one, that's an important thing to know, to make sure that our assumptions are better, right? We're not assuming that a family has certain things they may not have. Similarly, sometimes families don't have access to a body if there had to be some kind of medical procedure that was involved in the baby's birth, or if there's an autopsy going on or something like that. So when we make assumptions about a family's ability to have things like a funeral, we can be really unhelpful to families and even hurtful as we reiterate that the church will only give them certain things if they have certain things that not all families really have access to. Other kinds of things that we can assume can be also hurtful, like what we assume grief should look like, right? So there's a whole chapter in the book where I go through, what does grief look like? What does this look like for those who mourn? What's normal? What's the right way to grieve? A lot of people ask me that, both people who are grieving themselves and people who are walking with others who are grieving. What's the right way to grieve? And sometimes we have this assumption that, oh, if you're grieving healthily, you're going to cry a lot. And if someone's not crying, we think that there's something wrong with how they're grieving. Or we might think, oh, if you have a miscarriage, you should grieve for less time than if you have a stillbirth, because in stillbirth you had more time to bond with the baby. But that's not necessarily true either, right? So these assumptions can be really harmful in the kind of care that we can give families, assuming that they have access to certain things, that they're going to look a certain way, when that may not be the case. So I really encourage you to try to avoid making assumptions. Learn a little bit more about what kinds of things might be involved. What has society taught you? What has society told you? That there would always be a body, right? I think that's a message a lot of us get growing up, but that's not always true. Did society teach you there's a certain way that you're supposed to grieve, or that men are supposed to grieve, or mothers are supposed to grieve, right? What do you know about grief, or how did you learn that? And what kinds of assumptions might be really helpful for your families, and which ones might actually be more harmful than good? The third practice I'd like you to shy away from is defending, specifically defending God. So I mentioned Dr. Alan Wolfelt before. He has a really great book for clergy where he goes into detail on why we don't need to defend God. My very short synopsis here is a lot of families will be angry when they lose a child, right? And that could be true at any kind of loss as well, not necessarily just the loss of a little one to miscarriage, stillbirth, or infant death. But a lot of times we get mad, and we get mad at God. And I think this is really normal. This actually looks really typical from a grief perspective. We see people getting mad at the baby for dying. That's very normal. We see people getting mad at themselves for not being able, quote unquote, to carry the baby to term. That's very typical as well. But we also see people getting mad at God and saying, God, why would you do this? Why would you let me have this child to just take them away? And one of the things that can happen is families can share that anger at God with us, especially if we're in that ministry capacity. And it can be really, really hard to have someone rail against somebody that you love and to sit there and listen to that, right? So sometimes our gut reaction can be, I want to defend God. I want to tell this person, like, no, God really loves you. No, God will work this all for good. No, God isn't the one who's at fault here, right? But actually, it's a lot more effective, as we see in grief research, if we allow that person to process their feelings and then maybe gently remind them that even with those angers, those frustrations, God still loves them. I'm always reminded of the scene of Jacob wrestling God, right? This idea that you can be angry, you can be upset, you can be in even physical confrontation with God or God's representative, the church, and you can still be in relationship. Whereas if you're not mad, some of those families will just leave. They'll just go away. They'll just stop being in relationship with God, right? So we don't need to defend God. That anger can actually be a really good sign that someone is still in relationship with God. Dr. Wolfelt also says a pretty good line about God being a big boy. He doesn't need us to defend him, right? He can do that himself. But that idea that we might want to provide some kind of defense for why this would happen or why God would allow something to happen, that's really natural if we love God and if somebody is mad at God at the same time. But I really encourage you to try to avoid defending and just listen. Give that person the gift of your presence and listening, to think about, where are they at? Where are they at in their wrestle? And how can I support them in that so that they can keep wrestling instead of running away? So those are some of the things that I advise you not to do. Don't preach, don't assume, don't defend. But let's turn instead to, what are the best practices of things to do when you're working with a family who has experienced or expects to experience some kind of perinatal loss? The first thing that I recommend is that you say, I'm sorry for your loss. This might be really obvious and second nature to some of us, and it might be kind of a novel idea to others, and that's all right. But even recognizing I'm sorry for your loss as a societal norm doesn't happen very much, especially with situations of miscarriage, where people are so early that there's this perception that that loss doesn't really count, right? So saying I'm sorry for your loss is a great gift of recognition and validation of someone's parenthood that you can give them, or of their siblinghood or grandparenthood or whatever the case may be. So I really encourage you, if you find out that someone has experienced a loss, to immediately respond, I'm so sorry for your loss. The next best practice is to be present. So as you might have noticed in my discussion of those things to avoid, a lot of it is sitting and listening to the person, right? Being present with the person. And I often say that the gift of your presence is the greatest gift that you can give a lost family. On page 35 of my book, I go into some details about what this means for you. And this is not always pretty. This is not always easy or good, right? When we are called into someone else's suffering, that demands that we change. I often think of Simon of Cyrene, who probably really didn't want to pick up a cross and carry it, probably didn't want his little boys to get dragged along in this grotesque spectacle of someone being murdered, right? But he did it anyway. He entered into that. He was present. And that's what all of us are called to as well in this situation. That can be really hard, to sit and listen. That can be really hard to enter into someone's pain, to have to think about grief, to have to confront these big questions ourselves. But there's a beauty in that gift that can never be replaced. No matter what kinds of gifts we give lost parents, food is wonderful, right? Helping them around the house, amazing. Taking any living children out so that they can get a little break to nap, fantastic. But just being present, being there with them in pain, I think that's the greatest gift that we can give. I do want to note, though, like I said, this can be exhausting. So in the book, I talk more about self-care strategies for how to make sure that you continue on sustainably in this kind of care and this kind of love, because it does demand a lot from us, a lot of self-sacrifice, and making sure that you continue to be healthy so that you can minister to the families around you is incredibly important. The third best practice that I want to note is that we can help the family get what they need. So if you find out about a loss, there are a lot of things that might come up that a family needs. And the first thing I encourage you to think about is safety. So does it seem like this person is in a safe situation? By safety, I mean, does this person seem like they may harm themselves or others? And that's something a lot of us are attuned to when we take different trainings, right? To make sure that if that person needs immediate care and help in order to stay safe or to keep the people around them safe, we should do that. One other thing I want to bring up to you is that the #1 cause of death for women who are pregnant in the United States is intimate partner violence. Domestic violence is a huge problem in terms of women's care and women's health. And we also see that might even be higher, might even be a worse problem among families who experience a loss as the end of their pregnancy. So if you have any sort of sense that that person is not in a safe place, whether it be because of themselves or because of the people around them, that should be your first priority, to make sure that they get the help that they need. I also want to note that what kinds of help you give a family in terms of meals or care for older children or things like that might look really different depending on the age of the baby. So if the baby passed away at, say, 8 weeks gestation, really early on in the pregnancy, the kinds of things that that family might need could look really different than if the baby passed away at 8 months old. Right? So in the book, I go through some details on different scenarios. I think page 19 is miscarriage, page 21 is stillbirth, and page 23 is infant loss. Some suggestions of what you could do in each of those scenarios. Sometimes for miscarriage, for example, people don't get time off of work. So helping someone strategize what they might need there could be really different than an infant loss, where oftentimes people will be able to get time off of work. Or for an infant who has died, a family may be able to have a funeral and may need a lot more help planning that, whereas many parents who experience a miscarriage aren't able to have a funeral and won't need help planning a funeral. So I encourage you to think a little bit about what kinds of help might be appropriate for different families given the age of their baby. Also, I want to highlight that helping a family get what they need may depend upon your role. You may be in a position where it is appropriate for you to say, do you want me to come over and be with you while you labor? Labor still happens, even with very early losses, often, right? Do you want me to come over and be with you for the birth of your baby? For some of us, that's a really appropriate thing to ask for some of the families who need our care. For others, maybe that's not appropriate, or maybe that's not the best route to take. But all of us can probably say, do you have a meal train yet? Can I set that up for you, right? That's pretty universally accepted as an appropriate act to take, and families always need food. Basic things are really hard in grief, like feeding yourself, remembering to get out of the house. So depending on your role, there might be certain ways that you can help families do those kinds of things that are more appropriate or less appropriate, and I encourage you to discern those carefully. But always remember, creating a meal train is just a great basic go-to strategy for support, no matter what your role is. Finally, one way to help families get what they need is to check out the emotional first aid support card that Ave has made available from the book. So it takes a lot of the recommendations from the book and distills them all into just one card. And this card is meant to be printed out and kept near your parish phone, or kept near your cell phone, or kept somewhere where when you have that call, because you'll get that call, you'll be able to go to that and immediately refer to, okay, is the person safe? What kinds of things might be appropriate in this situation, and work from there. So if you don't have that yet, feel free to email me at abby@abbijorgensen.com or to reach out to Ave, and we'll make sure that we get you that emotional first aid support card. So helping families get what they need can be complicated, but once you have your defaults, once you know what you can go to, it gets easier and easier to be able to enact that protocol, to just go into your default mode of how do I care? First of all, by making sure that person is safe. And second, adjusting to what that family needs, potentially depending on the age of the baby and potentially depending on my role. Finally, the last best practice that I want to suggest to you today is to get grief informed before this happens. Now, this may have already happened to you. You may have already encountered a family who experienced a loss and told you about that. You definitely have already encountered a family who's experienced a loss, right? But you may have already cared for that family. It will happen again. The sad and tragic reality is that this will continue to be a problem in our society and in the human race. So we know that we're going to encounter families who experience this again in the future. And my encouragement to you is to get grief informed before that next family. So being grief informed means learning about the realities that families may face, especially regarding perinatal loss, that we don't necessarily have, that society hasn't necessarily taught us or shared with us. thinking about what does grief research say, thinking about what does the Catholic Church offer in these kinds of situations. These are questions we can ask ourselves now. We don't have to wait until that next family needs us. So in the book, I cover several different examples of things that might be helpful for you. A lot of the grief research is in there, a lot of suggestions for defaults for your support, and there's a lot of other opportunities through different Catholic organizations. Redbird Ministries, for example, is a great resource for people who are supporting families through older child loss, especially. You might also find a lot of help with Elizabeth Ministries, which really focuses primarily on miscarriage. So finding these resources, reading these books, understanding what families may need before they need it can be a great gift to give them. So best practices: say I'm sorry for your loss as your first response anytime someone has a loss. Be present to that family, even when it's hard. Help the family get what they need, whatever that may be, and depending on your role. And get grief informed before this happens again or happens the next time. With those things in mind, I want to invite you to take a minute and write down a couple of things from our time together today. I'm a professor, and this is something I often have my students do and that I often do myself, right? Write down your takeaways so that you remember them. You know what your next action step is. You know what you want to bring with you from our time together. You stepped into this webinar bravely to talk about something that's really, really hard, and I want you to step forward from this webinar with a plan. So first of all, I invite you to write down 3 things you learned or you reconsidered this afternoon. So maybe you heard something you hadn't heard before. Maybe you had to think about something that normally you don't have to think of. Whatever those are, 3 things you learned or reconsidered this afternoon. And next, I invite you to write down 2 things you want to adjust in your approach or think about more. So maybe you've been defaulting to always telling someone, God has a plan. God has a plan. God must have wanted your baby, right? Maybe now you're starting to rethink that based on what we talked about today. Or maybe you've never really thought about what you would say if someone called the parish number and you picked up and they said, I'm experiencing miscarriage, right? Maybe you want to think about that more. So whatever that kind of world is for you, what are 2 things that you want to adjust in your approach or think about more? And finally, I encourage you to write down 1 thing you want to learn more about. Do you want to learn more about what the Catholic Church says about babies who are baptized and who aren't and how they get funerals? Do you want to learn more about what miscarriage can look like at home versus at a hospital and what families might need in response to those? I hope my book serves as a great starting point for you to find those sources of information. But if you want even more than what's in the book, please reach out to me and I will help you get the information that you're looking for. So what is that 1 thing that you want to learn more about so that you can better support lost families? With those takeaways in mind, what you learned, what you want to adjust or think about more, and what you're going to learn more about, I'm going to turn this back over to Erin. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm really looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Abby. And I invite all of you with us to send in questions, right? We have an expert here. Let's use this opportunity to get those questions answered, to learn more. Let me take back presenter mode here. As everyone is thinking or writing or typing, I think this is so helpful. And as you know, when maybe we are shocked to hear of someone's, impending loss or loss, sometimes it's hard to think about the correct way to respond in that moment, right? And so to have some of these already in place, how you will respond would definitely help. And something, again, as simple as I'm sorry for your loss really can open up, I would imagine, some conversation, maybe some sharing just with that statement.
Yeah, absolutely. I call these social scripts. This is a term from sociology that we use about a lot of things, right? But what is your default? What is the thing that you immediately say? And I think for a lot of us, we've been trained that if you go to a funeral for an older person and you see the person who's grieving, the first thing you're supposed to say is, I'm so sorry for your loss, or you have my condolences, or you have my sympathies, right? We have these social scripts, but we don't have as many of those in the cases of perinatal loss. So what I really want to encourage you to do is think about how easy it is to just take that one and immediately make that your default, right? Immediately, that's the thing you go to. And then that could open up further avenues for conversation, right? That could open up what that person needs. That could open up that person sharing with you. Or you may have to say, I can either bring over a meal this week, or I can drive you to a doctor's appointment. Would either of those things be helpful to you right now, right? And like moving forward into, okay, how can I help? That's the next step. But even just the default of being able to say, I'm so sorry for your loss. That's a vast improvement over what society offers our lost families right now.
Absolutely. And I like the idea too of giving specific things that you can do instead of, call me if you need something, right?
Absolutely. Because many of us have probably been in a situation where we were really stressed or maybe even in grief, and someone said, let me know if there's something I can do to help.
Yeah.
And the creativity that it takes to come up with what that person can do to help, right? That's a huge burden administratively to put on somebody who's stressed or in grief. And we've all probably experienced that of not really knowing how to respond to someone who said that. So I often talk about how if you can come up with specific options and then offer people a choice, like here are the things that I can do, A or B or C or all three of them, right? That's so much easier for them to accept help and to accept your service than if you just say something that's really well intentioned and beautiful, like, let me know if I can help, but maybe not as useful as something else could be.
Right, right. Okay, we've got some questions coming in.
Wonderful.
Can you rename the resource for parents grieving the loss of older children? Is that
Yes,
Redbird?
that's Redbird Ministries. Yeah, that's a great resource that opens up chapters that are often parent led so that your local area can have a group talking about perinatal loss. So there are a lot of wonderful grief support groups, including one that Julie McKay runs that I get to help her with called Bereaved Parent Community Group that are available to everybody. But then if you're looking for something in person that's not virtual, but is actually near your house, Redbird Ministries is great for that. They also do have a lot of resources for people who have lost children at older ages. So Redbird Ministries is where you want to go.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, next one. What is the procedure at the hospital following the loss? Do they work with clergy?
That's a really good question. I have had vastly different experiences with this depending on the hospital. So sometimes your hospital system is going to be the thing that determines this. There have been situations where I'm not even allowed in the room and I'm not a clergy member, I'm a doula. So there's already sort of a role for me to play in labor and delivery. And sometimes they won't even let me in. But most of the time, I think if somebody is supporting that family, hospitals do make an effort to get that person in, whatever that looks like. So for clergy, I can't speak to that because I'm not a clergy member, but I can tell you that I have worked in many situations where clergy have been working alongside me or have come in later in the process. I might be there for labor and delivery, but then a priest might show up, right, or something like that. So getting a hold of your local hospitals is actually a great way to get grief informed. You could call labor and delivery today, right, depending on your time zone, maybe tomorrow, and say, hi, I'm a Catholic priest, I'm a deacon, I'm whatever I am, right? And I was just wondering, in cases of loss, what your protocol is for my role there. And that can be a great opportunity to get those answers now. Don't wait until you need those, right? Get those answers now so you know, oh, at this local hospital, I can just show up and show them my card and I'm good to go. At this hospital, I have to have a form filled out ahead of time. I better make sure I do that now. Really, those are really good things to think about now. So if you are a clergy member, you will have to do some digging on how hospitals approach you. If you're a doula, you get in a lot easier because they know who you are and they know how to get you places. So that's my answer. I hope that that's helpful.
Yeah. Would starting with the chaplain of the hospital too maybe be a good place?
I think that can be a really good place, especially if you have a pre-existing relationship with the chaplain of the hospital. Sometimes things work differently in bereavement cases and labor and delivery than they do in other parts of the hospital. So that's always worth an extra call to labor and delivery, I think, just to make sure that you're talking to the people who actually are enforcing the rules. But the chaplains, especially if you know them, are going to be a great resource.
Right. So, Abby, tell us a little bit about your work as a bereavement doula. Are you like on call at the hospital or do individuals seek you out? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So this can look different for different folks. I have my own independent practice, which means that I can go to a lot of different hospitals wherever I'm needed, or I can support at home births too. A lot of our lost births are actually home births, right? A lot of women who experience miscarriages are sent home from the hospital. Like, tell us if anything goes wrong, when you're thinking, yes, something is wrong, like I don't have my baby. So I chose to work in the independent sphere because that lets me serve all of those different people. But there are people who are specifically devoted to hospitals, and that means that if someone has a loss at that hospital, even if they don't know what a bereavement doula is, they're going to get one, right? They're going to have access to that resource, which is beautiful. That's a beautiful ministry. It's not the ministry I'm called to, but it's a beautiful ministry. So there are lots of different ways that that kind of work can look. I do often show up for labor or support families through labor, whatever that may look like for them. If we know ahead of time that baby's not going to survive birth or isn't going to survive very long after birth, I may be working with that family 30 weeks during pregnancy, getting ready for birth, starting to plan, like, what are the moments that you're looking forward to? How can we make this birth experience as peaceful or even joyful as possible, right? What are the ways that we can bring out your values, bring out your faith, bring out your moments with your loving family that is going to be helpful to you in this experience? And then also sometimes being a bereavement doula means listening to people's birth stories afterwards, even if I wasn't at the birth. My client who was farthest removed from her birth, it had been 52 years since the death of her child, and she had never told anyone her birth story. And she wanted to talk to me because she wanted to tell someone, right? And just being able to listen to that, to receive the story of her daughter's existence for the very first time, like, that's an incredible gift to me. And that listening is a gift that I can give to her. So bereavement doula work can look a little different depending on a lot of factors, like when we find out that baby has died or is going to die, when baby's born, what kind of support families need for months or years or decades afterwards. But that's a little bit about what I do.
Okay, thank you so much. Got another question here. What is some suggested language to help influence others who mean well, but say potentially harmful things? This happens from close ones as well as strangers. I believe their hearts are in the right place, but hurtful, harmful things are commonly said.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. I think part of that depends on your role in this scenario. So if you're the lost parent and somebody is saying things to you that are not helpful, I think you can be a bit, for lack of a better word, sassier. So I, as a lost parent, have experienced this myself, and I work with a lot of clients who have family members who say things or friends who say things that are really well-intentioned, but really ill-advised, right? And in that situation, when I'm the one responding or when those people are the ones responding, it's okay to point out that that is not helpful, right? That is shining a mirror up to someone and showing them, like, this is what you're doing, just so you know, like, just so you know what's going on here. The idea of turning the other cheek is inviting someone to reflect on the damage that they're doing to you, right? And so that kind of response might look like, if somebody says something really hurtful, let's go with the example we used before. God must have really wanted your child. Maybe even saying back something like, I had one client just say, well, I wish he'd wanted me too then. And that kind of, all right, that do you see how that maybe isn't what you were going for? One of the things I often advise clients to say is, here's how I'm interpreting what you just said. Is that how you meant it? Right? So what I'm hearing you say is that God wanted my child and just took my child despite my suffering, despite, like, God was just stealing a toy like my toddler does, right? Is that really what you meant? Because that can give the opportunity to repair any hurt from that relationship and to help that person kind of communicate better what they really meant, which was probably not that, right? It was probably really something else that that person was trying to communicate. But I also have had clients where the easiest thing for them is to just not do the emotional work of trying to give that person an opportunity to learn, but to just say, that's not really helpful for me, and just leave it at that, right? And I think all of those could be appropriate. It's a little trickier when we're not the lost parent, when we're like a third party in this, which the beginning of the question kind of was worded to make me think maybe that's where we were going. So I want to make sure I address that too. So say you're in the parish office and you hear someone else who represents the parish say something that maybe wasn't the best. If it was really hurtful, I would say something in that moment and say, one thing that I think I'm getting from this is that we know how much God loves you and wants to be with you right now. how can we be with you as representatives of God's church, right? Like pivot the conversation, try to get us away, and maybe have a private conversation with that person later. Like, hey, I jumped in there because I heard you say this, and I learned in this book, or I learned in this webinar, or I was thinking about how I would have interpreted it, and it wouldn't have come off to me the way that I think you meant it to come off. So having the opportunity to help that person become grief informed later can be great as well. I hope that that answers the question. I know I answered it 3 different ways. Maybe none of them were what you were looking for. Hopefully something was going in that right direction for you.
I think so. And if you want any follow-up, you can put it here.
Beautiful.
Yes. How can we get an emotional first aid card?
Yeah, so you can email me, abby@abbijorgensen.com. My last name doesn't have an O, it's not S-O-N, it's S-E-N. So you can make sure it's Abby Jorgensen, Jorgensen.com. And Ave has those as well, but reach out to me first because Ave is much busier than I am.
Thank you. Okay, here we go. Another one. What if the family didn't want the pregnancy? How would that change how you respond?
So I would still immediately start with, I'm sorry for your loss, right? It's still a loss, whether the baby was wanted or anticipated or not. It is still a loss of a life, it's still a loss of a human. And that is something that I would immediately start with. But one of the things that is really apparent in a lot of those cases is that families have to do twice the work of reimagining their future, right? They were imagining their future without a child, and then they had to imagine their future with a child, and then they had to go back to imagining their future without a child again. And that's a lot of transition for any of us to go through. So entering into that conversation with compassion for that set of transitions, and then also knowing that a family might experience a lot of emotions, and emotions are not sins. This is one of the parts of the book that I had the most oomph to writing, was like, emotions are not sins. The church is very clear about this. And if a family feels relieved that a baby didn't make it, that is not necessarily a sin. Right? So working through, okay, what is my judgment of this person? Where is my prejudice or my anger about what you should feel or what you shouldn't feel coming in? And how is that hindering me from loving them best right now? Right? How is my own prejudice affecting how I'm interacting with this family? So if I feel like they're relieved and I'm irritated by that, I need to note that in myself, and I need to work on that later, and I need to be just fully present to this person. I so often think of Simon of Cyrene. Simon of Cyrene was probably really ticked off, really like, what did this Jesus guy do? He shouldn't have done it. Now I'm getting sucked into this too, right? And that kind of judgment that somebody's feeling a way or doing a thing that I don't like or I don't agree with should not affect my ability to care for that person. I think this is true on even a bigger stage when we think about cases where parents' actions directly result in the death of their child. And those families still have a loss. Those families still deserve love and care as well, right? So where does my judgment come in? Where does my own hurt or my desire come in? And how is that hindering me from caring for this family right now? That's usually how I approach those kinds of questions.
Yeah, very helpful. Here we go, another one. I recently accompanied a couple who suffered a loss at 8 weeks. Baby's remains were collected when expelled naturally at home. They desired burial in a Catholic cemetery for their baby, and I offered to research this for them. Burial would require involving a funeral director, which requires a death certificate. This was difficult to acquire because baby's remains were delivered at home. And the doctor's office had no idea how to process a death certificate in this situation. We finally got it, but do you have any suggestions to make this smoother? She then says, I was blessed to get to know our state's Funeral Director Association's president, who is Catholic. He called the doctor's office to show them how to process a death certificate.
Yes, this was going to be my first suggestion. Your funeral homes are going to be your greatest ally in this situation, if you're going to find an ally, right? So going to the funeral homes directors, those are the people who know how to do the kinds of things the church may not know how to do, and the doctors may not know how to do. But also, I want to point out that this is one of those scenarios where the state laws matter so much. Like just in the United States, state laws on when people are permitted to issue death certificates differ by state. This is the policy, this is a law question, right? And then where the church is allowed to bury people with or without a funeral home being involved, that's a state question. That's a policy question, right? And so the ways in which these kind of big esoteric rules and laws impact our daily lives as lost parents, these really big, important questions as lost parents, right? Doing advocacy, calling up your local funeral homes and finding out what the protocol is. You don't have to have a loss to have an investment in making sure lost families can get their children's remains buried if they want to. So finding out, where does this break down in my state? Is it that the church doesn't know how to get a death certificate? Is it that the church needs a death certificate in order to bury a child? Can we do just a burial of a child without a funeral home involved, or does it have to be with? Does the funeral home talk to the doctor's office, right? All these moving pieces are pieces that a lost family has to figure out for themselves most of the time. So I'm so grateful for the person who sent in this question, accompanying this family and taking that load of research, that administrative burden off of that family. Like, thank you for that. That is such a gift. And if we could all do that, right? If we could all just find out what the rules are, find out what the laws are in our local area so that we can help families navigate that, or so we can write to our representatives, write to our legislators, ask our funeral home directors if they can streamline this process. Like if someone made a webinar on how to issue a death certificate at 8 weeks gestation, think of the number of hospitals and doctors and churches that would benefit from that, right? So doing some advocacy work is an answer to this. And I think that's something that falls on those of us who aren't grieving really hard right now, who aren't experiencing that loss or didn't just experience that loss, right? That's something that we can do concretely that can really help lost families in the future.
And is that something that you would do also as a bereavement doula if necessary?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Another question here, how to approach the subject of safety, especially if threat of harm is suspected?
Okay, and I'm wondering then if this is like somebody's safety from themselves or someone's safety from someone else. But some of the first things to know is that if you ever have questions, you can call the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Hotline in the United States, which is always open. And you can call them with a hypothetical question. You can call them and not tell them who you are. So if you have concerns and you want to get an answer from an expert on this, you can just call somebody. You're not in this alone. There are people who are here to help you with these kinds of things, right? I would always err on the side of doing a little bit more than you think. So if you're like, I'm not sure if I should say something or not, definitely say something. I'm not sure if I should let this person leave this conversation because I'm not sure they're going to be safe, then definitely keep them engaged as much as you can, right? So figuring out what are this person's options. If it's, say it's something where I'm worried they're going to hurt themselves, then I might need to get other people who are on their care team involved. So I might say like, hey, I'm really concerned when I hear you talk about your depression right now, or when you hear you talk about self-harm right now. Is there someone in your family that we can bring into this conversation that you know and trust really well? Or is there somebody else we can talk to? I want to make sure you're safe. That's my main priority. And it's really important to me that we have this conversation with someone else right now, right? Or if it's, you might think that that person is in an unsafe situation in their relationship, and saying something like, that really sounds like your human dignity is not being upheld. I'm really scared for you. Like, that sounds really scary. Can we call the domestic violence hotline together real quick and just see what they say about kinds of resources? You don't have to have the answers. You just have to know where to go to keep finding those answers, right? And so engaging that person, letting them know how much you care about them, and then getting them the appropriate help doesn't have to mean you know what the appropriate help is. You can just help them find that appropriate help that way.
Mm-hmm. Very helpful, very, very helpful. And do you have some of those resources in the book?
Yes. Yeah. So the domestic violence hotline is in there. The substance abuse and mental health hotline is in there. Like, there's so many great resources that are available to us. And the more that we share that and tell each other like, hey, did you know that this is a thing? Hey, keep this in mind. I mean, that's going to be good to know, not just for your friend who experienced a loss or somebody in your parish who experienced a loss, but the next time there's a teenage couple where things seem to be going really strangely, right? Or the next time that you have a friend who's drinking a little bit too much and you're not really sure what to do. Like, these are just good resources for us to know. Being grief informed is just good for everybody, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not just for families who experience loss. So the more that we share those kinds of resources, the better.
Most definitely. All right. Well, this has been, although a hard topic, Very informative, very helpful. I imagine everybody's wheels are kind of spinning. I'm thinking of a variety of things, to do, whether you're a parish secretary or, somebody at the hospital that picks up the phone, how to have this information readily available to be able to share or use it. And maybe some of these things are already in place in many institutions, but good to think about and start the process of having it. So as always, we like to offer a discount to our attendees when ordering at avemariapress.com using webinar code webinar0423. Would you like to say anything else about the book at this point, Abby?
I think really that the book, I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be able to put so much into the book. Like Ave was fantastic about letting me put in really nitty gritty details that matter to families, right? Like if I'm having a miscarriage, can I flush the toilet? All the way to the really big questions of, does God really exist if my baby is dying, right? And so the book starts the answers to all of that. But one thing that's really important to me to communicate is that this should be a starting place, not the ending place, right? This is the beginning of all the resources. But if you can have these conversations in your parish, if you can have these conversations in your hospital, with your funeral home directors association, with all those folks, that is where the work really happens. So I'm hoping you can use this book as a springboard into creating even greater societal support for families. If you want more ideas for how to do that, or if you have more questions, you can find me at catholicbereavementdoula.com, or you can just Google Abby Jorgensen and one of my websites will come up. But I really want to encourage you that one step that you take today, even if today is not a day that you interact with a lost family, it can be a day that you strengthen support for a lost family. So please check out the book, please check out my website, please think about these kinds of things and all the different ways you're going, like you said, Erin,
Right.
whatever that kind of orientation is for you. Doing something is just such a beautiful gift. And as a lost parent and someone who works with lost parents, I want to thank you for that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you so much for sharing this time and your experience and your expertise with us, as well as your compassion. And thank you for everybody also on here that spent this hour with us today. I know it is very valuable and will be fruitful to those that you minister to. I invite you to join us May 7th. Julia Sadusky is going to talk about how we can begin or continue speaking with our teens about sex and fostering that healthy teen sexuality in your church community. So please join us for that also. Otherwise, thanks again. Appreciate the time you've spent with us. I'll include some information in that follow-up email also from some of the things and websites that you mentioned today, Abby, so that you all don't have to remember that right now. Thanks again. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.